My grandfather was a man of cold silence and even colder secrets, a man who spent 60 years building a sprawling estate on the edge of the coastal cliffs while barely speaking a word to his own blood. When the lawyers called me to his study after the funeral, I expected a list of debts or perhaps a modest sum of money, but instead, I was handed a heavy iron key and a single, handwritten instruction that felt more like a threat than a gift. The letter stated that the entire estate was mine, including the millions tucked away in private accounts, provided that I never moved the massive, floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf that occupied the northern wall of his private study. For the first 3 months, the luxury of the house was enough to distract me from the strangeness of that request, but as the autumn storms began to batter the windows at night, the silence of the house started to feel heavy and thick, like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I found myself sitting in that study late at night, watching the way the dust danced in the moonlight, and I couldn't help but notice that the bookshelf didn't sit flush against the wall like the others in the room. There was a gap, a sliver of darkness barely an inch wide, and when the wind howled outside, a faint, rhythmic whistling sound would emerge from behind the wood, as if the house itself were breathing through a hidden throat. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday when the curiosity finally overrode the fear, and I placed my hands against the cold oak, feeling the unexpected lightness of the structure as it began to glide silently across the floor on hidden grease tracks. Behind the shelf was not a wall of brick or stone, but a door made of reinforced steel with a digital keypad that was glowing a soft, eerie blue in the shadows of the room. My heart was hammering so loudly that I could hear the pulse in my ears, yet my fingers moved almost on their own, typing in the date of my grandfather's death, a guess that turned out to be the horrific reality as the lock clicked open with a heavy, mechanical thud. Beyond the door lay a narrow staircase that spiraled down into the very foundation of the cliffside, a place that wasn't on any architectural map I had seen during the probate process. The air grew colder as I descended, smelling of salt spray and expensive electronics, a combination that made no sense for a basement built in the 1940s. When I reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a high-tech observation suite, a room filled with flickering monitors that showed every single corner of the house above, including the bedroom where I had been sleeping for the last 90 days. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized that someone had been watching me, recording my every movement, my every private moment, from this subterranean bunker while I thought I was alone in my inheritance. As I moved deeper into the room, I saw a second door, this one made of thick plexiglass, and behind it was a living space that looked like a high-end hotel room, except for the fact that it had no exit and was bolted from the outside. Inside that room, sitting on the edge of a perfectly made bed, was a man I didn't recognize. A man who looked up at me with eyes that were hollowed out by years of isolation and a strange, terrifying sense of relief. He didn't scream or run toward the glass. He simply pointed to a red light on the wall that had just started to blink, a silent alarm indicating that the main door at the top of the stairs had just locked behind me. I turned and ran back to the staircase, my boots echoing like gunshots against the metal steps. But when I reached the top, the steel door refused to budge, leaving me trapped in the darkness of the stairwell. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps overhead, the heavy, deliberate tread of someone who knew exactly where they were going. And I realized that the private security firm my grandfather had mentioned in his will wasn't there to protect the house. They were there to manage the prisoner, and now that I had discovered the secret, the contract likely dictated that I was to be managed as well. I leaned my head against the cold steel, listening to the muffled sound of the bookshelf being slid back into its original position, sealing the entrance and erasing my existence from the world above in a single, smooth motion. The panic was a cold claw in my throat, but I forced myself to breathe, to think, remembering the man downstairs and the way he had pointed at the blinking light with such intent. I hurried back down to the observation suite, my mind racing through every survival instinct I possessed, and I began to frantically search the desks for any way to communicate with the outside world. I found a headset and a series of radio frequencies listed on a laminated sheet, and as I toggled through the channels, I heard a voice, sharp and professional, discussing the breach in Sector 4 and the need for immediate containment. I realized then that they weren't coming to help me. They were coming to ensure that the secret of the hidden basement stayed buried, even if they had to bury me along with it. I looked at the monitors and saw 3 dark SUVs pulling into the long driveway, their headlights cutting through the storm like the eyes of predators searching for a kill. I had minutes, maybe less, before they entered the study and found the keypad, and I knew that if I stayed in this bunker, I would become just another ghost in my grandfather's collection. I turned to the man behind the plexiglass and shouted through the frame, asking him if there was another way out, any way to reach the cliffs or the sea. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and pained, and pointed toward a ventilation grate near the floor that was large enough for a person to crawl through if they were desperate enough. I didn't hesitate, grabbing a heavy metal paperweight from the desk and smashing the hinges of the grate until the metal groaned and gave way, revealing a dark, damp tunnel that smelled of the ocean. As I scrambled into the tight space, I heard the heavy thud of the steel door at the top of the stairs being forced open by the security team. I crawled through the darkness, the rough concrete scraping my skin and the sound of my own frantic breathing filling the narrow pipe, until I saw a glimmer of gray light ahead of me. The tunnel opened up halfway down the face of the cliff, a hidden drainage pipe that dumped out onto a narrow ledge overlooking the churning Atlantic Ocean. I pulled myself onto the ledge, the wind nearly ripping me from the stone as I looked up to see the flashlights of the security team appearing at the mouth of the tunnel I had just exited. There was no path up and no path down, only the freezing water 100 feet below and the certainty that staying on this ledge meant a bullet or a cage. I took a deep breath, the salt air stinging my lungs, and I did the only thing I could do to survive the inheritance I should have never accepted. I jumped into the void, the scream dying in my throat as the cold water rose up to meet me, swallowing the secret of the basement and my grandfather's legacy in one final, crashing wave. I woke up hours later on a strip of sand 3 miles down the coast, shivering and broken, but as I looked back at the house on the cliff, I knew I would never go back for the money or the keys. Some secrets are buried for a reason, and I had learned the hard way that the price of luxury is often paid in blood and silence. I walked toward the nearest town, my clothes tattered and my body bruised, but for the first time in months, I felt like the air I was breathing actually belonged to me. I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if the men in the black SUVs were still searching for the heir who escaped. But I was alive. The bookshelf remained closed, the basement remained hidden, and I was finally, hauntingly free. I should have known that a penthouse suite in the center of the city for $80 a night was a mathematical impossibility that could only lead to a very dark reality. The listing was perfect, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and a modern kitchen, but the host had left a very specific, handwritten note on the marble counter regarding the basement level of the converted warehouse. He claimed that the lower floors were undergoing massive structural reinforcements due to the age of the building, and that opening the heavy steel door in the pantry would result in an immediate forfeiture of my security deposit and an instant eviction. For the first 2 nights, I was too exhausted from my business meetings to care about what lay beneath my feet. But on the 3rd night, the city fell into a rare, eerie silence that allowed a very specific sound to drift up through the vents. It was 2 in the morning when I heard the unmistakable, muffled ringing of a cell phone, followed by the frantic vibration of dozens of other devices all buzzing against a hard surface at the exact same time. The sound was coming from directly under the kitchen floorboards, a digital chorus of phantom notifications that suggested there were people downstairs who were very popular or very much in trouble. I stood in the dark kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile, and realized that the structural damage excuse was likely a lie designed to keep guests from wandering into a space that was clearly being used for something active. I moved to the pantry and pushed aside the heavy crates of emergency water rations, revealing the steel door that the host had warned me about in his stern, laminated note. The handle was cold and surprisingly heavy, turning with a smooth precision that suggested the hinges were well-oiled and frequently used by someone who didn't want to make a sound. I stepped onto a concrete landing and looked down into a sub-basement that was illuminated by the flickering, blue glow of 100 different smartphone screens arranged in neat rows on long wooden tables. The room felt like a digital graveyard, filled with the personal belongings of people who had clearly checked into this building but had never checked out of their lives. I walked toward the nearest table, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw wallets, passports, and keys laid out next to the vibrating phones, all categorized by date and name. I picked up a driver's license and felt a jolt of pure electricity shoot through my spine when I realized the face on the card belonged to the guest who had reviewed this exact Airbnb just 1 week before me. He had written that the stay was to die for, a phrase that now felt like a sick, literal joke left behind by a predator who enjoyed hiding in plain sight. I realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that I wasn't just a guest in a vacation rental. I was the next set of data to be processed in a sophisticated identity theft ring that harvested more than just credit card numbers. The muffled sound of a heavy garage door opening at the far end of the basement sent me diving behind a stack of empty shipping crates, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I watched through a gap in the wood as 2 men entered the room, carrying a heavy canvas laundry bag that they dropped onto the floor with a wet, heavy thud that made my stomach turn. They didn't speak, moving with a professional efficiency as they began to sort through the contents of the bag, pulling out a watch, a wedding ring, and a smartphone that began to glow with an incoming call from Mom. One of the men looked toward the stairs I had just descended, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the steel door was resting slightly ajar instead of being firmly latched. He signaled to his partner, and they both began to move toward my hiding spot with a predatory slowness that told me they had done this many times before and knew exactly where a panicked guest would try to hide. I looked around frantically for an exit, knowing that the stairs were now cut off and the garage door was likely monitored by high-definition security cameras. I saw a small, industrial laundry chute in the corner of the room, a metal square that led back up to the main floors, but it was positioned 5 feet off the ground and required a leap that would definitely alert them to my position. I waited until the lead man was only a few feet away, his heavy boots scraping against the concrete, before I grabbed a glass jar of industrial cleaner from the shelf and threw it toward the far side of the room. The sound of the glass shattering against the metal tables acted as the perfect distraction, sending both men sprinting toward the noise while I lunged for the laundry chute with every ounce of strength I had left. I scrambled into the narrow metal tunnel, my fingers slipping on the smooth stainless steel as I pulled myself upward just as a heavy hand swiped at my ankle, missing me by a fraction of an inch. The climb was a nightmare of cramped muscles and the smell of stale detergent, but I pushed myself through the darkness until I tumbled out into the service closet on the 4th floor of the warehouse. I didn't stop to gather my things, sprinting toward the fire escape in my pajamas and taking the metal stairs 3 at a time while the sound of the men's voices echoed in the alleyway below. I didn't breathe until I reached the bright, fluorescent lights of a 24-hour gas station 3 blocks away, where the clerk looked at my trembling hands and immediately called the police. When the authorities arrived at the warehouse an hour later, the penthouse was empty, the furniture was gone, and the basement was nothing more than a hollow, concrete shell with no sign of the phones or the passports. I sat in the back of the patrol car, staring at the darkened windows of the building, knowing that if I hadn't followed that ringing phone, my own license would be sitting on a wooden table right now. I never got my security deposit back, and the Airbnb listing disappeared from the internet before the sun had even fully risen over the city skyline. I still have nightmares about the blue glow of those screens and the sound of 100 mothers calling phones that will never be answered by their owners again. I learned that the greatest dangers aren't found in haunted houses or dark alleys, but in the places we pay to feel at home when we are far from our own beds. Now, whenever I travel, I spend the first hour checking every vent and every floorboard, terrified that I might hear the faint, rhythmic buzzing of a hidden basement waiting for its next occupant. The advertisement for the garden-level apartment seemed like a miracle in a city where a cramped studio usually costs more than a month's worth of honest labor. It was a beautiful, brick-faced brownstone with ivy climbing the walls and a landlord who seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys after a 5-minute interview. The only catch, he explained while adjusting his thick glasses, was that I had to keep the industrial-sized dehumidifier in the hallway running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He claimed the old pipes in the building were prone to sweating and that the moisture would ruin the hardwood floors if the machine ever stopped its loud, vibrating hum. For the first month, I became used to the constant drone of the machine, a sound that masked the noise of the street and helped me fall into a deep, dreamless sleep every night. However, I began to notice that my neighbor from upstairs, a man who always wore heavy work boots and never looked me in the eye, spent an unusual amount of time in the shared basement laundry room. He didn't seem to be doing much laundry, as I would often hear him moving heavy objects around late at night, a sound that even the dehumidifier couldn't quite drown out. It was a Tuesday evening, around 3 in the morning, when a sudden power surge caused the entire building to go dark and the constant hum of the machine finally fell silent. In the newfound vacuum of sound, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. A soft, metallic clicking sound coming from behind the drywall in my bedroom. It wasn't the sound of a mouse or a settling house, but the unmistakable noise of a latch being turned and a heavy weight shifting behind the plaster. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, and watched as a thin sliver of light appeared at the base of the wall where the molding met the floor. The old pipes weren't pipes at all, and the smell that the dehumidifier was supposed to be masking wasn't dampness, but something much more metallic and stagnant. I realized that the wall was slightly offset, and as I pressed my hand against the cool surface, a section of the paneling swung inward on a hidden pivot. Behind my bedroom wall lay a narrow, concrete crawl space that stretched the entire length of the building, a secret artery that connected every apartment on the ground floor to a central hub in the basement. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to peer into the darkness, and saw a series of small, mirrored glass panels built into the back of the drywall. These panels were one-way mirrors, positioned perfectly to look into the bathrooms and bedrooms of every tenant in the building, including my own. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, a wave of pure, cold terror that made me want to scream, but I knew that any sound would alert whoever was in the tunnel. I heard the heavy thud of work boots hitting the concrete floor at the far end of the crawl space, moving toward my position with a slow, rhythmic deliberateness. The man from upstairs wasn't just a neighbor. He was a silent observer who had been living in the shadows of our lives while we slept just inches away from his reach. I looked at the crawl space and realized that the only way out of my apartment was the front door, but I could already hear the floorboards in the hallway outside my bedroom groaning under a heavy weight. He wasn't just in the walls anymore. He was coming for the source of the silence now that the machine had stopped. I looked back at the secret door in my wall and made a split-second decision to enter the crawl space myself, hoping to navigate the dark maze to the basement exit before he reached my room. The tunnel was tight and smelled of old dust and something sweet and rotting, a scent that grew stronger as I crawled deeper into the belly of the building. I passed the back of the neighbors' mirrors, seeing glimpses of other lives. A woman sleeping, a student studying, none of them aware of the predator that moved between their walls. I reached the central hub in the basement, a room filled with monitors and recording equipment that was powered by a separate, silent generator that hadn't been affected by the surge. On the main screen, I saw my own empty bedroom, and then I saw the door handle slowly begin to turn as the neighbor entered with a roll of heavy-duty tape and a pair of industrial shears. I didn't wait to see what he would do next, scanning the room for any way to lock him out or signal for help. I found a heavy steel bolt on the inside of the basement door and slammed it home, effectively locking myself in the control room but locking him out of his own nerve center. I grabbed the man's own cell phone from the desk and dialed the emergency services, my voice a frantic whisper as I explained the hidden tunnels and the man currently standing in my bedroom. The operator told me to stay put and that help was 5 minutes away, but those 5 minutes felt like an eternity as I heard the man realize the basement door was locked. He began to throw his entire weight against the wood, the hinges screaming under the pressure as he roared in a voice that didn't sound human anymore. I watched the monitors as he retreated from my bedroom and sprinted toward the laundry room, knowing he was going to use the main entrance to get to me. I looked around the room and saw a heavy wrench sitting on top of a toolbox, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white as I prepared for the final confrontation. Just as the laundry room door began to splinter, the red and blue lights of the police cruisers began to flash against the high basement windows. The sound of sirens filled the air, a beautiful, piercing noise that broke the man's resolve and sent him scurrying back into the darkness of the tunnels like a cornered rat. The police found him 2 hours later, wedged into a narrow ventilation shaft 3 buildings down, still clutching the shears he had intended to use on me. The building was condemned the next day, and every tenant was relocated while the city inspectors tore down the walls to map the full extent of the hidden basement network. I moved to a third-floor apartment in a modern building with no basement and no shared walls, but I still can't sleep in total silence. I bought a small white noise machine, but I keep it on the lowest setting, always listening for the sound of a latch turning or a floorboard groaning. I learned that a cheap price often comes with a hidden cost, and some landlords are interested in more than just the monthly rent. I still have the key to that old brownstone tucked away in a drawer, a reminder that the walls we think protect us are often just curtains for the things that watch us from the dark.